Hey everybody, what's going on? It's Dean Meadows, and this is another episode of Dean's Dialogue. Just put it on Facebook Live before we get to our topic for today about John's Gospel. We have made a transition. We are no longer Apologia Institute. We are the Daily Apologist, and for those of you who are asking, maybe why make this change, we've noticed a couple of things. Number one, that there are a score of groups who use the term apologia, so we don't want to get lost in the shuffle of that. Secondly, most of the time where we go places to present or speak, people struggle, or just in basic conversation with people struggle to say that name. So, for the sake of simplification and also to be maybe a little bit more recognizable, we've gone with the Daily Apologist. That's not going to change the content that we put out. That's not going to change, our desire for it to be edifying for you, and to be on the cutting edge of apologetics. We're actually expanding that, and what we're doing is we're going to go ahead and make age-specific content. So that's why we're rolling out, kid apologists. That's why we're rolling out teen apologists. That's why, for those of you who kind of want to know what's going on in the apologetics world, or hey, what are the leaders of the atheist and skeptical community saying, that's why we've got the apologetics report that we're going to roll out as well. Still going to podcast, still going to be on Twitter, still going to be on Instagram, still going to post to YouTube. So for our Twitter feed, our handle is now at daily_apologist. For Instagram, it's just one long word, the Daily Apologist. For YouTube, it's the Daily Apologist as well. Our Facebook page is being built right now. So we ask that you be patient with us, as there's going to probably be some overlapping between the new website, www.thedailyapologist.com, and Apologia Institute. So just be patient with us. Hopefully by polishing the pulpit, all those kinks are ironed out and we've got that stuff rolled out for you. We firmly believe that this is just a better step for us to help equip Christians to engage culture and to expand God's kingdom. And we would humbly ask that you continue to be our supporters, our prayer warriors as well. Obviously, we couldn't do what we do without y'all's love and support and prayers. And so we ask that you make that transition with us as well. The easiest way to do that right now is to go ahead to Facebook once we're done here today, and follow and like the Daily Apologist Facebook page as well. So now that we've got the big news announced, let's go ahead and move on to today's episode. So what we're looking at today is the dating of John's Gospel. Now, John is often considered to be the last gospel that was written. And so there are also those people who think that the Gospel of John is written in the 2nd century by somebody else. The question is that true? Do we have good internal evidence and external evidence to believe that the Gospel of John was written prior to the close of the 1st century? I think that John's Gospel is definitely the last one written, and I also think that it's well within the 1st century. And so this is kind of the point I want to leave you with today as we move through the information, that just because John's Gospel was written last doesn't mean that it was late. That just because John's Gospel was written last doesn't mean that it was late. So let's look at some internal evidence to see if that points to an early date for the Gospel of John. So by way of review, the first thing that we need to establish, and that I continue to pound each and every episode as we look at both the Synoptics and John, is that there is good testimony that these guys were the authors of these Gospels, right? So 1st century Bishop Clement testifies that John's gospel was the last one written, but also that John the apostle, who is in the inner circle of Jesus's 12 disciples, he wrote this gospel. Irenaeus says the same thing. He's a second century church father. But even later church fathers like Origen and Eusebius and Jerome, they state the same thing. They say that, hey, John was last, but also that the apostle John was the writer. Now, something that takes place that's very interesting in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 5, verse 2, John notes, and I'll read it here. John notes the following: that there's in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, in Aramaic, it's called Bethesda, a pool which has 5 porches. Now, what's interesting here is that John uses the present tense in describing this pool. And why is that interesting? That's interesting because that pool was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. And so this kind of begs the question, if John was written after the first century, why mention this pool in the present tense as if it's still around? That just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So this suggests, from the internal evidence, the way in which John describes this is that John is describing something that is still around. So that would place this gospel before 70 AD. Another interesting piece of evidence is that it seems that John is familiar with the death of Peter. Remember in John 21, 18 and 19, Jesus, in talking to Peter, in trying to rehabilitate Peter from his betrayal, notes the way in which that Peter is going to die. And this is what the gospel authors do, as we said in the last episode. They are excellent at taking something that was said while they were following Jesus or while an event was happening and then commenting on its fulfillment, right? So it seems that John does this here with Peter. He notes that what Jesus said about how Peter was going to die, and then he makes a comment, and he says that the reason Jesus said this statement was to show by what kind of death Peter was going to glorify God. And church history shows that Peter was martyred supposedly in AD 64. And so this is very interesting because it seems like John is familiar with the death of Peter. So in mentioning the pool of Bethesda that was destroyed in AD 70 and also being familiar with the death of Peter, it seems like this gospel could have been written in between that time, between 64 and 70. So what external evidence do we have that Peter wrote, or not Peter, that John wrote this gospel? According to the Monarchian Prologue in AD 200, it says that John was written during his time of exile. So that seems to, at the very latest, even if this other internal evidence is potentially wrong, it seems that, hey, John wrote this between 81 and 96. Now, as far as age goes, you might say, man, that seems like it is a serious problem. But in the work Ecclesiastical History, it's noted that John lived well into his old age. And we've seen that this is possible. We've seen this with Polycarp, who noted that he was a disciple for 86 years of Jesus as he's facing the governor as well. And maybe the most significant piece of external evidence comes from the John Rylands fragment. And the John Rylands fragment is dated to AD 25. And so this specific copy of John's Gospel is found in Egypt. So what does this mean? This means that the original had to have been constructed well before the Christians in Egypt got their copy. So that pushes the date of the original gospel back into the first century, is what most scholars would say. So, regardless of how you fall, or regardless of which piece of evidence you want to accept, if you say, well, I think the internal evidence is wrong, I'm going to go with what the Monarchian Prologue talks about. Well, hey, whether you go with the internal evidence or external evidence, the overarching narrative is that this gospel was written inside the first century while John was still living. So remember this, while skeptics might say, well, this is possible and this is possible and this is possible, it's not a matter of what's possible. I mean, we all know that anything is possible, but what's evidentially reasonable. And so if someone's going to say that John didn't write it, that John wasn't the original author, and that the dating has to be into the second or maybe even third century, they're going to have to produce historical evidence to counter what we already know through the evidence that we already have. So just remember that. Thanks again for tuning in. And on behalf of the Daily Apologist, once again, guys, thank you for your support. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your prayers. Remember to visit the site. And while you're there at the site, go ahead and subscribe to the newsletter so you can get updates on what we're doing, when things are being rolled out. This is an exciting time for the organization, and we hope that it's an exciting time for you as well. And if you have any questions, maybe they're related to New Testament reliability, which is the series that we're on right now, or maybe it's not related to New Testament reliability, whatever it is, go ahead and email us at thedailyapologist@gmail.com. And once again, remember, equip yourself to engage culture. Thank you once again for tuning in. Have a great day, and God bless.